The name the FBI has been trying to find in the Nancy Guthrie case may not belong to a man hiding in the shadows tonight. It may belong to someone already sitting in a jail or prison on some other charge, still unconnected to Nancy's disappearance. That is not a confirmed fact. It is one of the darker possibilities hanging over this case now that investigators have moved beyond the first rush of tips and into the slower, colder work of DNA and genetic genealogy. And that shift matters, because as of April 6, 2026, Nancy Guthrie was still missing, and no arrest had been announced. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She was living in the Catalina foothills area of Tucson, Arizona. According to the FBI, she had difficulty walking, relied on a pacemaker, and needed daily medication for a heart condition. In other words, she was not somebody who could simply vanish for days and be fine. Every hour mattered from the start. Here is what we know about that last night. On January 31st, Nancy spent the evening with family. Reuters reported that she was last seen by relatives after visiting the Tucson home of her older daughter, Annie Guthrie, and Annie's husband. Investigators later built out a tighter timeline. According to reporting from the Arizona Daily Star, Nancy arrived back at her own home at 9:48 that night, and 2 minutes later, at 9:50 p.m., her garage door was shut. That is the last ordinary moment in this story. Hours passed. Then, in the early morning of February 1st, something happened at Nancy's front door. The FBI later released video showing an armed person at her house. Reuters described the figure as a man wearing a ski mask, a backpack, gloves, and a holstered gun. The Arizona Daily Star reported that the home's doorbell camera was disconnected at 1:47 a.m. Then, at 2:28 a.m., Nancy's pacemaker lost contact with her phone line. That 41-minute gap has haunted this case ever since. A camera goes dark. A vulnerable woman's pacemaker stops communicating. And by midday, Nancy is gone. Shortly before noon that Sunday, Nancy's family called authorities after she failed to show up for church. That detail may sound small, but it tells you something important about her life. She was expected. She had routines. People noticed quickly when she was not where she should have been. This was not a woman drifting out of contact for a weekend. Her disappearance landed like an alarm. And then came the details that made the situation even more disturbing. Investigators said Nancy's wallet, cell phone, and daily medications were left behind inside the house. Reporting from the Arizona Daily Star also said blood found on her front porch was later confirmed to be Nancy's. By February 5th, authorities publicly acknowledged that point. Whatever happened at that house, it did not look like a planned trip, a medical detour, or a simple wandering episode. It looked like a crime scene beginning to take shape piece by piece. For many Americans, the family name made this case instantly familiar. Nancy was the mother of Savannah Guthrie from NBC's Today Show. But what drew people in was not celebrity. It was the family's visible shock. On February 4th, Savannah, Annie, and their brother Cameron released one of several public videos pleading for Nancy's safe return. 3 days later, Savannah appeared again and said they would pay. By February 9th, she was still asking the public for help and saying the family believed their mother was still out there. At the same time, another layer of confusion entered the case. Reuters reported that purported ransom notes had been sent to media outlets. At least 2 deadlines came and went. One letter, according to the Arizona Daily Star, demanded $6 million. But even with those letters, there was no known direct contact between any suspect and either the family or law enforcement. That detail is crucial. The notes created noise, fear, and pressure, but they did not produce proof that Nancy was alive, where she was, or who had taken her. Then came the image that changed the public understanding of the case. On February 10th, yes, the FBI and the Pima County Sheriff's Department released the doorbell footage. The public could finally see the person who had been near Nancy's front door in the hours before she disappeared. Not clearly enough to identify him, but clearly enough to understand the threat. He was masked. He appeared armed. He was not a harmless passerby. According to Reuters, the sheriff later described that footage as the single biggest clue to emerge in the case. That same day, investigators moved fast on a possible lead. Authorities searched a home in Rio Rico, south of Tucson, and took a man in for questioning. But he was later released and no arrest followed. For families watching from home, that moment felt like it might be the break. Instead, it became the first of several hard stops in this investigation. But that was only the beginning. But 5 days later, according to Reuters, investigators recovered a pair of gloves discarded about 2 miles from Nancy's home. The gloves resembled the pair worn by the masked person seen in the video. Suddenly, the case had something solid. Not a rumor, not a note, physical evidence. And inside those gloves was DNA. For a moment, that looked like the breakthrough everyone had been waiting for. Then, on February 17th, authorities said the glove DNA did not match any known profile in CODIS, the National DNA Database. That was a setback, but it was not the end. Investigators later turned toward genetic genealogy, the same general method that has helped identify suspects in other major cases when a direct database match was not there. In other words, they still believe the science might lead them to a name. And that brings us back to the question hanging over this case tonight. If the DNA eventually points to a person, who will that person be? A stranger from the neighborhood? Someone who has crossed the border? Someone who has never been on police radar at all? Or, as some investigators and observers now quietly wonder, could the name already belong to someone the system has touched before? Someone already locked up for something else, waiting to be connected only after the family tree is built and the lab work is done? Right now, that remains speculation. But the search for Nancy Guthrie has moved into a different phase now. It is no longer only a search for a missing woman. It is a search for a name. And before we get to the DNA trail that may finally produce one, there is something else we need to look at first. The strange pattern of those early ransom messages and the question of whether they distracted investigators or pointed toward the truth. The ransom notes were supposed to make this case simpler. In reality, they made it harder. The first apparent ransom message surfaced on Monday night, February 2nd, when Tucson station KOLD reported receiving an email tied to the case. Investigators said it demanded money, set one deadline for Thursday at 5 p.m., and a second deadline for the following Monday. Then, on February 6th, KOLD received another email connected to the case and handed it to federal investigators. But by February 9th, an FBI spokesperson said the Bureau was not aware of any ongoing communication between Nancy Guthrie's family and whoever might have taken her. That gap is important. A real kidnap for ransom case usually moves toward direct contact, proof of life, and instructions. Here, the notes created fear, but not a usable path. That is where this gets interesting. The messages pulled public attention toward money, but the physical evidence kept pointing somewhere else. Investigators were dealing with blood on Nancy's porch, signs of forced entry, and an armed figure at her front door in the middle of the night. Then the digital evidence got stronger. According to the Associated Press, even though investigators initially thought there was no useful doorbell footage because Nancy did not have an active monitoring subscription, digital forensics experts kept working the back-end systems. They recovered images anyway. What they found was not vague. It showed a masked person in a balaclava and backpack, trying to cover the camera with a gloved hand, then ripping out a plant from the yard to block the view. That looks less like panic and more like someone trying to control what would be seen. And once that footage was recovered, the investigation widened in a revealing way. On February 12th, authorities asked residents within a 2-mile radius of Nancy's home to share any camera footage they had. But they did not limit the request to the night she disappeared. They also asked people to think about suspicious activity in the month before she vanished. That tells you something. Investigators were not only looking for a man who showed up once in the dark. They were considering the possibility that Nancy or her neighborhood had been watched in advance. A person may have studied the house, the camera placement, her routines, and the quietest hour to move. At the same time, the forensic picture was getting more complicated, not less. Reuters reported that investigators recovered DNA from a glove found near Nancy's home, and also had DNA from her property that did not belong to Nancy or anyone close to her. Sheriff Chris Nanos later said the family, including siblings and spouses, had been cleared. So by the middle of February, authorities had at least 2 important truths in front of them. First, the family was not where the evidence was pointing. Second, there was biological material in this case that could belong to an outsider. That should have been the clean road forward. Instead, even that road got tangled. Reuters then reported something that added an entirely different kind of tension. According to a U.S. law enforcement official, the FBI had asked for key evidence, including the glove and DNA from Nancy's home, to be processed at the Bureau's lab in Quantico. Sheriff Nanos instead kept the evidence moving through a private lab in Florida, saying that approach had been agreed to and would be more efficient. The law enforcement official told Reuters the decision delayed critical analysis. Whether that disagreement changed the outcome or not, it meant that while the public was staring at ransom deadlines and suspect images, the agencies behind the scenes were not fully aligned on how the evidence should move. In a case where every day mattered, that is hard to hear. Then came one of the biggest disappointments in the entire investigation. On February 17th, authorities announced that the DNA from the glove found about 2 miles from Nancy's home did not match anyone in CODIS, the National Criminal DNA Database. Reuters also reported there was no match from other samples collected at Nancy's home. That mattered because the glove had looked so promising. It resembled the gloves worn by the masked person seen at the camera. It was found close enough to feel connected. For a few days, that glove looked like the first solid thread investigators could pull. Then it simply stopped giving them what they needed. So the case moved into slower methods: traditional detective work, purchase tracing, gun store checks, and the possible use of genetic genealogy databases. But that was only the beginning of the setback. By March 4th, Reuters reported that further DNA analysis traced those same gloves to a local restaurant employee who was not considered a suspect. In other words, the most public forensic lead in the case turned into a dead end. Imagine what that did to the family. For the public, it was just another update. For Nancy's children, it was another door opening and then closing. The clue everyone could picture, the glove on the roadside that seemed to match the man at the door, no longer carried the weight people thought it did. And once that happened, the case became harder to follow from the outside. The obvious lead was gone. The real lead, if there was one, went quiet. The emotional center of the case never went quiet, though. On February 24th, Nancy's family offered up to $1 million for information leading to her recovery. Reuters reported that Savannah Guthrie, in an emotional video, acknowledged for the first time that her mother might be dead, even as the family kept pleading for someone to come forward. Then, on March 22nd, the family made another public appeal. They asked people to think back not only to January 31st and the early hours of February 1st, but also to the evening of January 11th. They urged neighbors to check camera footage, journal notes, text messages, observations, and conversations. They also acknowledged publicly that Nancy might not be alive. That was a painful change in tone. Hope was still there, but it was no longer simple hope. And then, late in March, Savannah shared details that made the scene at Nancy's home feel even more personal. In her interview with Hoda Kotb, summarized by the Associated Press, Savannah said, "We are in agony." She said she wakes up at night thinking about what her mother went through. She also revealed that Nancy's back doors were found propped open, while her phone and purse were still inside. Those are not the kinds of details a family forgets. They are the details people replay in their minds at 2 a.m., trying to place one footstep after another in the correct order, hoping something finally makes sense. By the time Savannah returned to the Today Show on April 6th, Nancy had been missing for more than 2 months. No arrest had been announced. No suspect had been publicly named. The glove had collapsed as a lead. The ransom notes had produced noise, not answers. What remained were the harder things: the unexplained DNA, the recovered footage, the widened timeline, and the possibility that the case had started earlier than the public first understood. And that is where the story turns again, because once the obvious evidence fails, investigators are left with something less dramatic, but often more powerful: a hidden pattern, a family tree, and the possibility that the name they have been searching for may already exist in a file somewhere under a different case. And that hidden pattern is where the last part of this story begins. By the end of March, the Nancy Guthrie investigation had reached a point many families dread. The loud clues had either failed or gone quiet. The ransom notes had not produced a rescue. The glove found near Nancy's home no longer looked like the breakthrough people hoped for. No suspect had been publicly named. No arrest had been announced. And yet investigators were still moving, still testing, still asking the public to go back over dates, roads, memories, and camera footage. That usually means one thing: the public case has slowed down, but the private case has not. Here is the hardest truth in this story. The best chance of solving it may now depend on evidence the public cannot see. Reuters reported that investigators recovered DNA from Nancy's property that did not belong to Nancy or the family members who were in close contact with her. At the same time, authorities turned to investigative genetic genealogy after the most visible DNA lead, the glove, failed to produce a CODIS match and did not end up tying directly to the crime. ABC and CBS both reported that genealogy work was being explored for the remaining DNA evidence, not just the glove. That shifts the case away from headlines and toward family trees, lab comparisons, and patient elimination work. That is why the title of this video matters. The name the FBI has been searching for may not belong to a mystery man still running free in the way people picture it. That possibility exists, of course, but another possibility is quieter and, in some ways, more chilling. The person connected by DNA could already be sitting in a county jail, a state prison, an immigration detention facility, or another form of custody on an unrelated matter. That is not something investigators have publicly said. It is an inference from where the case stands now. No public suspect, no public arrest, unresolved outside DNA, and a turn toward genealogy because the usual database route did not immediately identify the person. What happened next in public was not a dramatic arrest. It was something sadder. On March 26th, Savannah Guthrie gave her first television interview since her mother disappeared. According to the Associated Press, she said, "We are in agony." She said she wakes up every night thinking about what her mother went through, and she shared details that brought viewers back into the house itself. The back doors were found propped open, while Nancy's phone and purse were still inside. Those details do not solve the case, but they sharpen it. They tell you this was not a woman preparing to leave. It was a home interrupted. Then came April 6th. Savannah returned to the Today Show for the first time in more than 2 months. Reuters reported that Nancy was still missing at that point, with the case unresolved, despite public pleas, massive attention, and a reward that had grown to $1 million from the family. On air, Savannah kept it simple. It is good to be home. But behind that return was a reality no family wants to live with. She had already said in an earlier video that they were still holding on to hope, while also facing the possibility that her mother may already be gone. That is where the case stood as of April 8, 2026. No public resolution, no named suspect, no announced arrest, just absence. And there is one more detail worth sitting with for a moment. The official timeline shows that investigators believed something was wrong almost immediately. Nancy was dropped off at home at 9:48 p.m. on January 31st. Her doorbell camera was disconnected at 1:47 a.m. on February 1st. At 2:28 a.m., her pacemaker app lost contact with her phone. By noon, family members had reported her missing after she failed to show up for church. Blood on the porch was later confirmed to be Nancy's. From the beginning, law enforcement treated this as an abduction or kidnapping, not a routine missing person case. So what is the biggest reveal available right now? It is not that police found Nancy. They have not. It is not that a kidnapper confessed. None has. The biggest reveal is that this case may ultimately be solved not by the ransom notes, not by television exposure, not even by the masked man video alone, but by the one thing a suspect cannot talk his way around: biology. The camera footage gave investigators a person to visualize. The crime scene gave them urgency, but the DNA may be what gives them a name. And if that name finally comes back, it may belong to someone who is not living some glamorous fugitive life at all. It may belong to a man already under lock and key for something else, overlooked until this case forces the record into focus. That remains only a possibility today, but it is a real one. For older viewers especially, there is something deeply unsettling about that idea. Nancy was 84. She needed daily medication. She had limited mobility. The public story around her case has often focused on her daughter's fame, the emotional videos, and the national attention. But at the center of this is an older woman in her own home, a woman with routines, family, church, and ordinary habits, who should have been safest where she was. That is one reason this case has stayed with so many people. It touches a fear that feels close to home. And yet, even now, the family has not stopped asking for help. The FBI reward was initially posted at $50,000. Then Reuters reported it was increased to $100,000, while the family separately offered up to $1 million for information leading to Nancy's recovery. Authorities have fielded tens of thousands of tips. They asked neighbors for footage within a 2-mile radius and for suspicious activity in the month before she disappeared. That tells you they still believe somebody saw something, recorded something, remembered something, or noticed something that did not make sense until later. So as we close this story, we are left with two realities at once. The first is painful. Nancy Guthrie is still missing. The second is quieter, but it may be the thread that matters most. Investigators appear to have enough evidence to keep building toward a person, even if they are not ready to say who that person is. In cases like this, silence does not always mean nothing is happening. Sometimes it means the answer is getting closer, one record, one lab result, one branch of a family tree at a time. And that brings me to one question for you. Do you think this case is more likely to be solved by one overlooked eyewitness tip, or by the DNA and genealogy work happening behind the scenes? If you follow this case and want clear, careful updates without the noise, subscribe and stay with me for the next development.